So I want to talk about Jesus' origin story. And Trudy, you can bring up a very pixelated nativity scene. How many of you grew up with nativity scenes as a normal part of your Christmas decor stuff, right? Linda Smetzer, how many nativity scenes do you own currently? You can be honest, it's a safe place. Thousands, that's right. Harlan just shakes his head. It's like there's too many to count. How many of you, was that like a centerpiece of your childhood or your Christmas decor stuff? Was that a big deal for you, right? I've got one from Africa that I picked up in a visit to Kenya. It's carved out of a branch, maybe that thick, and it's about that tall, and it's hinged. So you open this thing up, and the nativity scene is carved, etched inside there. You've got Joseph and Mary and the little baby on the inside. Super, super cool. And super, super small. It takes me like 5 seconds to display it, which I like. And the rest of the year it just looks like a piece of wood sticking around. So you got that. You know, that nativity scene, we are so familiar with this and so comfortable with this that we are actually blind to much of what we see. In this series called The Prince of Peace, we're actually going to take a look at who Jesus was, starting today with all of his birth narrative stuff and kind of lumping it in together and asking ourselves, what does that origin story tell us about what might be in his future? Because it's a pretty significant thing, and there's some parts of it that, again, I think are lost on us. We forget because when we see this, we get all warm and fuzzy, and we're like, it's Christmas, and we forget about some of the intricacies of the story. But I want to remind you of what we looked at the last several weeks. By the way, wasn't Scott Henning great last week? Okay, I think I heard an audible yes. Yeah, very good. I watched his stuff on YouTube after I loaded it, and I thought he did a great job. You'll be hearing more of him in the future, and I think he's got a lot to offer. That guy walks deeply, and I admire him and listen to what he has to say because he's tapped into the Spirit in really deep ways. Well, what we've been trying to say for the last 6 weeks through this Being Changed series on Daniel 1 through 6 is to help you understand that those stories of Daniel 1 through 6 are not meant just for historical footnotes, but to recognize that they were important stories for the people of Israel. Because the people of Israel were under oppression for hundreds and hundreds of years. And those stories gave them hope that God was somehow still with them, still on top, still doing stuff, even though they were under oppression and they didn't really call their own shots. And they gave them hope that God was still there, was still worth following, all that stuff. And so when we think about the first century, that's where we are today, and this birth narrative of Jesus, which I'm going to read for you, we need to be fully aware of what was going on in the time that he was born into. So this is, early first century common era. And I want to give you just a brief quote. It's not on the slides at all, but this comes from an author named Ronald Sider. His book, If Jesus is Lord, is one that I'm using as reference for a lot of this series that I'm teaching you this month. And this is what he says about the first century. The evidence is clear. From the time of the death of Herod I in 4 BC, there were repeated violent rebellions against Roman rule in Palestine, ancient Israel. Both in Galilee, that's the northern country where Jesus hailed from, and especially in Jerusalem, the capital city, revolution of one sort or another was in the air and often present on the ground. The sources often indicate a religious motivation. Frequently, N.T. Wright points out, these movements were led by messianic or quasi-messianic figures. And the Romans frequently squelched them with crucifixion. Violent messianic revolt, grounded in the belief that God would intervene to bring the messianic kingdom if the Jews would dare to rebel, was clearly part of the Jewish life in this period. One of the things that we forget because we're so far removed from this is we think about Jesus as the Christ, which is the Greek word for Messiah, which is Hebrew. Both words mean the same thing, the anointed one. And we think about Jesus Christ as if it's his last name and he was the only one. But the reality was there were lots of Messiahs in the first century, lots of people claiming to be God's anointed one, ready to lead the revolt And the question in the air was, who is going to be that leader who's going to lead the charge where God is finally going to come behind and all of our pitchforks and shovels and stuff is going to be enough to overthrow the Roman Empire? That's what was in the air. You've certainly heard it before, I know, here and probably elsewhere, that the Jewish people at that time were looking for a military leader, somebody of military strength, because that's their view of how are we going to get back on top. It's going to be by squashing Rome itself. And they are the military superpower, so that means that what's going to happen is another type of overthrow that's even greater militarily with God's help. So that's what they were looking for. Now, yesterday was December 7, in case you weren't paying attention, and that marks another anniversary of the attack on Pearl Harbor, which led the United States headlong into World War II, where a lot of men, particularly in our country, were drafted into service, putting on pause indefinitely whatever plans they had for their life, to go serve toward, massive world war on all directions, really. Most of them have passed on who've been part of our church, but we had some of those World War II heroes right here at our church. And the stories that they would tell were pretty incredible. There's a guy named John Thornton that very few of you remember now, that he and his wife were just pillars in our church. He was a submariner, I don't know the exact terminology for it, but he was like the chief of the boat for a submarine, which meant he was a non-officer, but he was basically running all the stuff that was called out. What is it, Curtis?
Cobb.
He was the chief of the boat, the cob?
So he was actually the one in charge of the boat. All enlisted people.
Yeah.
Basically second to the captain.
Yeah, that's right. Really big deal. My cousin was chief of the deck on an aircraft carrier a long time ago now. So a similar kind of a role. But back then, it was a different game being a submariner. It was an incredibly dangerous part of the war. And the success ratio was not great. But John had stories of great military courage and moving things forward that helped us. We have other people of heritage in our church that also helped that whole thing move forward. And when we think about what the people of Israel were probably looking for in terms of somebody to lead the charge, we can kind of imagine if we were to create a story about who that person would be, sort of our ideal character, and we started to think about an origin story for that person. If we were looking for a hero today to lead us into some kind of monumental battle, I bet we can come up with some stuff, some things that we would expect in the family of origin story. I wonder if you can help me think about that. It's like one, wouldn't you guess that we would expect somebody that was going to be a military champion would probably come from perhaps a military family? Does that make sense? Sure. I've got friends that are in the military. I think about Buzz and how he's in the Coast Guard. His dad was in the Coast Guard, had a great career. Now Don Montoro, Buzz, he's had a great career in the Coast Guard, and it makes sense. I have other friends that are in the military, and they come from kind of a heritage. If we really want to unpack it, maybe if we were looking for somebody of late, maybe their grandfather, great-grandfather was a World War II hero, and they were enamored with the stories of heroism that they heard. And their dad maybe went to the Naval Academy, the Air Force Academy, or West Point, and he himself, the father, or maybe now mother, were also strong in the military and did great things in that regard. And so we would expect that this kid that's born into this kind of a culture with such a service to country would naturally lean in that direction. We would almost predict that as the father went to one of the academies, perhaps the son or daughter would as well, and get all the training necessary so that they would be the military champion. Doesn't that make sense that that's what we would think about? Because you look at me, And you think, how in the world did this clown get to be a pastor? Well, that is a circuitous journey, but the reality is it's not that much of a surprise that I grew up in a pastor home. Both of my parents born and raised in pastor homes. This is water for me, and I'm a fish. I know this culture like the back of my hand because it's been my family culture. It makes sense that I would feel comfortable in this environment. And so when we think about a military figure who would lead our people, if we're back in the ancient times of Jesus' birth, and they're all looking for somebody who's going to lead the revolt, very naturally we would expect that they're going to look for an origin story that's going to make sense to that. At least great athletes, great shape, great bravery. Those are the people that we're going to look to. But that's not what we've got. We have something quite different. And I'm just going to read the story for you and see what we see. So this is Matthew's telling the story. And by the way, where you come at the story in terms of the amount of historical accuracy you give it, that's up to you. And really, for our purposes today, is somewhat irrelevant. And what I mean by that is, if you think that what the Christmas story says in Matthew and in Luke is exactly what happened, the way it says it happened, it's exactly what God orchestrated, God bless you. That's fine. If you think that later writers in the Jesus tradition, people who believed in Jesus, when they were writing the story of Jesus and their hero, did what people did back then, which was create an origin story, which made sense for their hero and the one that they were following, God bless you. That's fine. It's not purposeful for what we're looking at, because what I want you to pay attention to today are the details of the story that we have, given that they came at a time where everybody wanted the revolt. Everybody wanted the battle. Everybody was looking for the warrior to come and do business with Rome. That was what everybody was looking for. This is how Jesus the Messiah was born. His mother, Mary, who was engaged to be married to Joseph. Mary, just to clue you in, was a peasant girl, maybe 12, 13 years old. She was of marrying age because she could finally get pregnant. And once she was around that age, you never knew when she'd actually get married and start having kids. She was a peasant. She was incredibly poor. She was of no social status in people's eyes. She was completely forgettable, to use a Simon what's-his-face phrase. That's who you need to see here. Not glowing Mary, but you need to see very poor Mary. And she was engaged, which was a legal marriage, really, to Joseph. But before the marriage took place, while she was still a virgin, she became pregnant through the power of the Holy Spirit. Joseph, to whom she was engaged, was a righteous man that did not want to disgrace her publicly, so he decided to break the engagement quietly. So this tells us something about Dad. First, let's back up the truck a little bit and remind you about Dad. So Dad was a carpenter. He taught Jesus how to do carpentry skills. When we think about carpentry today, you might think about a journeyman carpenter who is able to go into homes and make from scratch beautiful cabinetry or something like that. That's not the image you should have. The image you should have of Jesus is the guy hanging out by Home Depot early in the morning, hoping they get picked up for any kind of job whatsoever. That's the day laborer that Joseph was. Very poor, and in terms of the social ladder, right at the bottom. That's Joseph. Very poor, very humble. And now we recognize that he was also principled. That something just happened to him that he was not going to be happy about. Even though he was dirt poor, he still had power. He still could have raised a fuss, and the church would have gotten behind him. He could have called for her to be publicly disgraced, but he didn't do that. So it tells us something a little bit about the home in which Jesus was going to be born. A home of grace, a home of respect, even though there was cause for something worse. Well, as he considered this, whether or not to make it worse, an angel of the Lord appeared to him in a dream. Joseph, son of David, the angel said, "Do not be afraid to take Mary as your wife, for the child within her was conceived by the Holy Spirit, and she will have a son, and you are to name him Jesus, for he will save his people from their sins." Now, if you're Joseph, you don't have any power in the world, really. You're a day laborer. You're lucky to get enough money to put a little bit of food on the table. But one of the things you look forward to someday is having your kid. And that firstborn male, you look forward to that. And you know what you're going to name your firstborn kid? You're going to name him your name, because that's your signature in the world. The last thing Joseph wanted to hear was, "Oh, and you don't even get to name your firstborn son Joseph. You're going to name him Jesus." And he went for it, which tells us a little something about the sensitivity of Joseph. It was an emasculating thing, by the way. And yet he went along with it. This tells us something about the emotional state of Joseph and his capacity to be really mature in a very complicated situation. All of this occurred to fulfill the Lord's message through his prophet. "Look, the virgin will conceive a child. She will give birth to a son, and they will call him Emmanuel," which means God is with us. Now, this actually hails from Isaiah, a prophecy book in the Old Testament. It has to do, the original prophecy has to do with a king at that time, many hundreds of years before this happened. But because it happened then, that's how they also did it, is they would see, oh, it's happening again. And so that's why you see it show up as a prophecy fulfilled. Well, when Joseph woke up, it all happened in a dream, he did as the angel of the Lord commanded and took Mary as his wife. But he did not have sexual relations with her until her son was born, and Joseph named him Jesus. Now, if we hustle along to Luke chapter 2, we hear how Luke described what happened. At that time, the Roman Emperor Augustus decreed that a census should be taken throughout the Roman Empire. This was the first census taken when Quirinius was governor of Syria. All returned to their own ancestral towns to register for this census. And because Joseph was a descendant of King David, he had to go to Bethlehem in Judea, David's ancient home. He traveled there from the village of Nazareth in Galilee. He took with him Mary, to whom he was engaged, who was now expecting a child. And while they were there, the time came for her baby to be born. She gave birth to her firstborn son. She wrapped him snugly in strips of cloth and laid him in a manger because there was no lodging available for them. Now, have you heard this story before? I hope I didn't spoil anything, but I want to talk about this for just a moment and help you see some things that we easily miss. A lot of times in our nativity scene, we have a cute donkey there that they got to ride, which was probably a borrowed donkey, because how in the world can poor Joseph afford even a donkey? But also notice, it's a donkey. It's a borrowed car, so to speak, and it's a borrowed beater, so to speak. So you're looking now at a 1987 Chevy S10 with 500,000 miles on it, right? That's what you need to picture. And it's from Michigan, which means all of the wheel wells are rusted out entirely. We're talking balding tires. We're talking the picture of a lemon is going down the road. That's what you need to picture here with Joseph, because that's as good as it's going to get if you're coming from where Joseph came from. And now I want you to think a little bit more about what the story is telling us. Regardless of its origins, just look at what the story is telling us about the beginnings. So they're on their way to Bethlehem. Mary is like this pregnant. She's going to pop any second, which women feel great at that level of pregnancy, as we know. And they're getting into this town of Bethlehem, which is a small village. Now, I grew up in the Midwest. And one of the things that Midwesterners say about the Midwest, which is they say is true about the Midwest, it's not as true about California, is they say that people are more neighborly in the Midwest. And that's kind of true, partly because we don't build fences the same. You can see through the fences in the Midwest, whereas here we make little fortresses and we have no idea, what's happening beyond the fence with our neighbor. So there's a sense of that certainly in the air. You're talking about a little tiny village, a few miles outside of Jerusalem, in a culture which prided itself on hospitality. We know that this is still true today in the Middle East, that the sense of being hospitable to the neighbor is a central core thing that's not really Not really true to the same degree here in the United States. We like to think of ourselves as friendly, but there's a real disconnect, and it's not quite the same depth of cultural value as it is even today in the Middle East. There are stories of when the war with Iraq and Afghanistan was really ramped up, and some of our own soldiers who, by the way, were the enemy over there, were in trouble and needed rest or needed help, and they would go into a village, and the villagers would take care of their enemy. Profound. I mean, mind-boggling that that would happen. So I want you to think. Now you've got a very pregnant woman going into little Bethlehem, a small town where everybody knows each other and everybody's super nice, where you let your kids play in the street and walk themselves to school. That kind of Mayberry kind of a place. And nobody, as they're knocking on doors, not even the innkeeper, can find any inch of room? That does not make sense. Because for that to be true, that means that when they knock at the door, and let's say they are all full and there's nobody there, I'm going to tell you, not because I'm all that, because I'm hardly that, but I'm going to tell you that as a guy, if I see a way pregnant woman come to the door and I've already got my place on the couch, this is not that chivalrous, but I think most of you would agree, if you were not that pregnant and you saw a very pregnant woman about to pop, you'd say, you know what, have the couch. I'll go, just give me a blanket or something, I'll be fine out under the eave. We would do that, wouldn't we? I think we would. Think about a culture that is hardwired to do that, and nobody is allowing her to come in. That is an ultimate rejection of culture. And the detail is there on purpose, so that we look at what's going on at the very beginning of the story and say, wow, that's tough. I wonder where they ended up. They end up in a manger, which doesn't look anything like that, because that's got a nice little stone column there, which costs a lot of money. The reality was, it was probably a makeshift cave in the side of a hill, just deep enough to get some farm animals in there for the innkeeper. I want you to think about that. And I've pushed you this way before in different years, but I want you to think about this picture, which just looks like this wonderful, beautiful scene, but I want you to think about what it was really like. Now, first of all, it was disgraceful. You're about to have a baby, nobody's letting you in. The best that can be done is in a filthy, dark, damp cave. A literally crappy environment. Don't go barefoot is what I'm saying. There are goats, there are sheep, maybe a cow, and they all just go wherever they want to go. And that's the environment. And we think about this beautiful little manger, and we, take our time before we, put our little baby Jesuses in it, and we put it with straw, and it's cute and all that, and we forget this is a feeding trough for animals. It's filthy. This is the worst environment that you could ever pick, that you could ever script for an origin story. What is being told about this? Why are we seeing this? Well, there's more to the story. So let's see what the story has to say. So going on. That night that Jesus was born, there were shepherds staying in the fields nearby, guarding their flocks of sheep. Suddenly an angel of the Lord, by the way, shepherds watching the sheep overnight, low on the totem pole, lost the coin toss, probably the newbies. Nobody wants the graveyard shift if you're a shepherd. So we got another group of lowest on the totem pole people, and they become central figures in the story that we place in our manger scene. Suddenly an angel of the Lord appeared among them, and the radiance of the Lord's glory surrounded them. They were terrified, but the angel reassured them. Don't be afraid, he said. I bring you good news that will bring great joy to all people. The Savior, yes, the Messiah, the Lord, has been born today in Bethlehem, the city of David, and you will recognize him by this sign. You will find a baby wrapped snugly in strips of cloth lying in a manger. And at that manger part, they're like, what? How is that possible? This It's not, do they even have mangers in hospitals? No, they don't. So immediately they're stunned, first by the display and then by the details of the story. This kid is going to be found in a manger. Suddenly the angel was joined by a vast host of others, the armies of heaven praising God and saying, "Glory to God in highest heaven and peace on earth to those whom God is pleased." When the angels had returned to heaven, the shepherds said to each other, "Let's go to Bethlehem. Let's see this thing that has happened, which the Lord has told us about." So they hurried to the village and found Mary and Joseph, and there was the baby lying in the manger. After seeing him, the shepherds told everyone what had happened and what the angel had said to them about this child. All who heard the shepherd's story were astonished. But Mary kept all these things in her heart and thought about them often. The shepherds went back to their flocks, glorifying and praising God for all they had heard and seen. It was just as the angel had told them. All of this, given the context, given the fever pitch of everybody in Israel wanting a military leader to come and restore glory to the people of Israel through military conquest, all of those hopes are dashed with this story, because nothing in this story says future military champion. Nothing. There could not be a more humble beginning than the birth of Jesus. He's in a stinky cave with animals. He's surrounded by dung. It's dark and damp. His parents have been insulted culturally just by being born into the status they were born, and now rejected by a community that prides itself on hospitality. The story can't have a worse start. And I hope you're starting to see that. We wrap it around in beautiful layers of Silent Night and Away and a Manger and Oh Holy Night. And we have this wonderful, warm and fuzzy Hallmark card picture of what it must have been like. And I'm just here to tell you, not so. If we just go with the story, the storytellers, be it God or the writers of the text, they're both giving us details, just looking at the story to tell us something about what might come. And what might come is not military. What might come is humility and peace. In Matthew's account, there's another character there, and in your bulletin I gave you another picture of it. There's another character set that shows up. Who am I missing? The wise men, right. These guys from the east who are filthy rich, highly educated. They see a star in the sky, which is its own funny little story, that they'd be looking to the stars for a sign from God, which that's just a crazy thing the Jewish people didn't do. But anyway, these scholars from the east see a star. They say to themselves, this is the sign of a new king that's been born. So they get all their king worshiping clothes on, and they get their entourage, and we know how it looks. They all have their own private personal Italian camel, and they got it going, and they're on their way, and they probably have an entourage around them, some people bearing arms just to protect them, because we know what they're carrying, right? Spoiler, but they're carrying gold, frankincense, and myrrh. These are gifts, very, very expensive gifts that you give to royalty, only royalty. And so they're carrying this stuff, and wherever they go, they make a scene. They go try to find out where this kid's supposed to be born. They announce that this star that nobody apparently noticed in Jerusalem saw, and now they're finding out where exactly is this supposed to happen. They find out it's Bethlehem. They keep following the star, and they find themselves not at the Ritz-Carlton in Bethlehem, but they find themselves in this cave. If you are that wealthy, everybody knows it by looking at your clothes. Lynn and I were down in Southern California. It was our 5th annual trip to Southern California this time of year, because there are 2 concerts which my son plays in, one on Monday, one on Thursday, so we just have fun in SoCal, catch both concerts, and then make our way back. And so this Sunday, or this past week, on our way from Anaheim, because we had to say hello to Disneyland, on our way back to Malibu, where they go to school, we stopped at the shopping mall in what city? It's escaping me. It's a lot of movies are made there. It's right on the tip of my tongue. It's very close to Hollywood, Beverly Hills, right there. What is it? Yeah, it's one of those, but I'm missing the name of Century City. That's it, Century City Mall. And Lynn and I go in this thing, and we immediately recognize that we are not where we belong. Because all of the stores, it's really interesting, but all of the stores in the interior where all the cool stuff these are the stores that, we just giggle when we look at the price tags of sweaters and jeans and shoes at places like this, because it might as well be Beverly Hills, right? And so we're looking for like Old Navy and American Eagle and H&M. Oh, they're there, but they're way on the outskirts. Let's keep those people way out there. So we were hanging out there to get a couple Christmas gifts and stuff, and just kind of laughing at what we were seeing. And it's fun people watching. I mean, that was cool. But we recognized very quickly that if you've got wealth, nobody has to really guess about that. They can look at your jacket, they can look at your jeans, they can look at your shoes, and know right away where you stand socially. Down at Pepperdine, we were at the Christmas concert, which is a packed out thing. And this mass choir, they're known for their choral music program, and they're incredible. But all the guys are in tuxes. The women are in black formal dresses. The whole orchestra, which Noah's in, they're all wearing tuxes and black dresses and all that. Very, very formal. And a lot of people dress up in their Christmassy attire and try to look sharp. I generally look like a slob most of the time, so I just, played Pete, and it was okay. But I was kind of Christmassy, so that's something. But as I was thinking about this and that scene, it reminded me a little bit of these wise men, because the wise men were loaded. They had more money than they knew what to do with. And you have to imagine them getting off their camel, first of all, realizing where they're going. This is not at the Ritz. This is not going to be this wonderful spot, but now they're finding it's in a cave. A cave is not does not usually have a large entrance. So if you want to go see the baby, you're not going to be able to see it from on top of your camel. So they had to get down from their lofty position on their camel. And if they wanted to see the baby in the manger, they were probably going to take off their fancy hat. And you can just picture what's going through their mind. Do you have any idea what I paid for this robe? You have any idea what these shoes cost? These shoes cost more than you make in a year, Joseph. And I got to go step in that? The very scene itself forced the people, the only people in power in the story, to bend low, to recognize they were going to see somebody who is coming at the world entirely differently than they ever could have imagined. Because this Jesus was born in abject poverty and absolute humility, not coming from a military background to give us a nod that someday he's going to lead the revolt, but from the most humble circumstances, from a human father who showed dignity and grace long before Jesus taught about it. All of this paints a picture that's very different than we're used to. Now, there's a place for dressing up and honoring and all that stuff. But I got to tell you that when we were listening to this concert, and it's extraordinary, just picturing the kind of wealth that is all around us. And Pepperdine it's an expensive school. We're very grateful for good scholarships. And I'm pretty confident that my kids are coming from the more humble means of any of the students that are there. Because there are Maseratis, there are Audis, there are Teslas, there are plenty of Mercedes and Beamers in the student parking lot. Way nicer cars than I've got, which just is a nod to, wow, there's some serious cash going around the parents who are getting their kids to this school. And I thought, I actually laughed out loud as I was hearing this and listening to it and being a part of this experience. One, in part because here we are talking about the birth of somebody that would probably make all of us really uncomfortable by his poverty. And we're dressed up singing about it as our champion. And how weird that is. And how weird it needs to be for you and me. Because it's weird. And I wonder if you're living in that tension at all. And I'm wondering if you're not living in that tension at all, I'm wondering when you'll wake up. Because we are people of power. But the one who was born was not. The most humble. Everything about him said, Prince of Peace. There's no other option. The part that I actually laughed out loud, it was okay because it wasn't like during a rest, in the symphony or anything, and everybody heard Pete, belting one out. But it was actually while we were singing these songs, and it wasn't laughing out loud as if to laugh at everybody else in mockery. It was actually laughing with a reality that was right before us. Because the reality of the songs that we sing about this one coming into the world to change the world, the thing that I found so hilarious that made me laugh out loud is that the only way the world actually truly gets transformed is the way that Jesus came into the world and the way that Jesus chose to live, which was as a Prince of Peace, not as a warlord. And I thought, that is the joke. That is the turnaround that the Spirit of God is doing, flipping the tables of our sensibilities, where we are so convinced that it is through our power that we control everything. And yet the one we follow is the one who changed the world, and he was powerless. And that needs to mess with us. That needs to give us pause. Because as fun as it is to get dressed up for a nice dinner and to pay respect to the one, the reality is that most of the people would have felt a lot more comfortable looking like this. Casual, just came off a hike kind of a look. Because this is more appropriate attire to go there. All this brings us full circle to asking the question, how does this birth narrative, how does this origin story, what trajectory does it suggest for this Jesus? You all have talked about your origin stories and how they set you up for who you are. Well, if this story offers us the same kind of a hint, it lets us know this is not going to be anything the people were looking for or even hoping for. It was a reversal. And I'm wondering if you're up for it. Seriously. Is this the Jesus that we still want to follow? Maybe you've never heard about this Jesus. Maybe the Jesus that you've heard about is the one that's going to come again in military conquest, which we'll take a look at in a few weeks. And I'm going to turn the tables over on that a little bit, because there are some details in the end stories that also give us a different picture of a true Prince of Peace. One who's not trying to control the world or bring peace to the world through force, but through love and grace and humility. So we have communion today. And I invite you to grab an element at your respective tables. Grab a cup, grab a little piece of cracker. And I just want to point out the obvious. That in the first century, the earliest writings about these elements, the broken bread, the cup, in our case, Belvita breakfast cookie and grape juice, they meant one thing. They meant one thing: death, defeat. Because when they looked at this cracker, they remembered a guy who got pummeled and killed by the Roman government. He didn't win the way everybody was looking for a win. And yet he won in a far greater, deeper, everlasting kind of way that required this. To say yes to Jesus is to invite ourselves into a tension of people living in great power. You have great power. Knowing that the one who calls us forward chose to come into the narrative powerless. You don't have to resolve it, but you have to see it. And it is a lifelong tension to work out. But if you're interested in pursuing that one who calls us, then take and eat the cracker. And the cup, to carry on the theme, many, many, many years later, they would look at the crucifixion of Jesus as a substitutionary atonement, the final act of sacrifice to wipe out all sin, which we can look at that and celebrate that, and okay, that's great. But remember the earliest audience, the people of Paul, the people of the earliest disciples, when they looked at this cup, they remembered what it really means, that this Jesus was willing to give his own life. This looks like blood. And that's why they drink it, not to be gory, but to say, you know, the way of Jesus is a far different way than the way of Rome. The way of Rome is the way of power, of coercion, of forcing our way. And the way of Jesus is just different than that. It's insubordination in a different kind of way that doesn't add more fury to the fire. It doesn't create more anger, it deflames. And that's what this is about, even though costly. It's why the disciples were able to sing in the dungeons, even while they were completely defeated. It's because they knew in the end the way of love, the way of grace, the way of peace is the only way to really save the world. Take and drink.